Welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Many thanks as always for tuning in. Appreciate you guys taking the time to check out what I'm doing here on YouTube. Please press subscribe if you haven't done so before. Please also press thumbs up on the videos, which means they'll get out to a little bit of a wider audience. About a month ago, I did a video on the channel called Mike Tyson versus the modern day elite heavyweight, or something to that nature in terms of the name. It was basically a extended video talking about Mike Tyson and when he was at his prime, and discussing how he would do against the likes of Anthony Joshua or a Tyson Fury. For those of you that are interested, it's still up on YouTube. If you run a search in your YouTube search bar, Boxing Gossip Mike Tyson, I'm sure it will come up as one of the top item or two. So please give that a look. That video was done as the result of a request that I received through Patreon from my man Firaz. Now, Firaz has been back in touch this month, along with a similar theme to that first Mike Tyson video. So let me start this by giving a bit of a shout out to Firaz for his continued support and for coming up with interesting topics for me to make videos over. And his request was for me to discuss how a peak Mike Tyson would do against a peak Evander Holyfield. So I've spent a little bit of time thinking about this video actually. I've done a little bit of research, I've changed my opinion 2 or 3 times. And I think one of the first things to do in assessing that question, I guess there's 2 steps. Step 1 is to define what both of their peaks were. And step 2 is to look at the 2 fights they did have. Maybe we'll acknowledge that when they did fight, neither guy or one of the guys wasn't at their peak, but nevertheless, you know, that still represents some of the best evidence out there. So let's rewatch those 2 fights. So I've done that, and yes, I felt after a little bit of time, it's now about ready to record this video and see how we get on in terms of assessing who I think would win between a peak Iron Mike and a peak Evander Holyfield. So let me start by saying, in that first video I did, Mike Tyson versus the modern elite heavyweight, I talked about what I deemed to be Mike Tyson's peak, which I viewed as the late 80s. I kind of talked in many ways about how he had a false peak, in the sense that the late 80s represented his best performances, but at the same time, because of circumstances outside of the boxing ring, maybe we never actually saw the best of Mike Tyson. And I think that's probably why he's become one of the most legendary figures in boxing. I think that's probably why he's become one of the most talked about and discussed guys when we look back at boxing, is because there's always that kind of mythology about him that no matter how devastating, how violent, how aggressive he looked, there was that whole other layer to come as he grew older and as he hit his physical peak, which is generally, you know, adjudged to be in late 20s, early 30s, that sort of point. But obviously he didn't do that in Mike Tyson's career. You know, he had time in jail, etc. But anyway, in that video I discussed that Tyson's best performances for me came in the late 80s, you know, mid to late 80s, so we say. When this fight with Evander Holyfield happened, now the first fight happened in 96, the second fight happened in 97. I just about remember these fights. I just about remember them, just about old enough. I can't say I watched them scoring them with a pen and paper at the time. I can't say I was doing technical breakdowns of fights at the time, but I do remember seeing them at the time. When the fight happened, the first fight, I believe, and I haven't made a note of this, so apologies if I've got this wrong, I believed the name of the fight on the fight posters was Finally. And having done my research, that was because this fight was actually talked about on several different occasions. It didn't happen due to Mike Tyson losing to Buster Douglas. You know, had he won that fight, maybe he'd have fought Evander Holyfield next time out. I believe that was the plan. Then there were injuries. Then there was the jail sentence that Mike Tyson went through. So the fight was actually billed as Finally. And I think a lot of the perception, and I've seen this online, particularly from a lot of Mike Tyson fans, is that by the time this fight came around, Mike Tyson was well past his peak. You know, Mike Tyson was at his most devastating in the late 80s. By the time you get to 1996, he isn't the same man he used to be. And when you look at the tapes of Mike, you do have to agree that perhaps he had slipped a bit. Perhaps the head movement wasn't quite as electric as it was earlier on in his career. Perhaps he was a bit slower. Perhaps most importantly, he had a bit less stamina, a bit less energy than the Mike Tyson we saw in his early career. I don't know. I think he did appear to have lost the step. Now, one of those things I've always thought is because Mike Tyson's style was so physically demanding, having to get low, having to be so explosive, so fast, so much emphasis on power and stalking. It's kind of the style you can't really fight unless you're mega, mega fit. If you go into a fight with 75% fitness trying to execute that style, for my money, you're going to come up short. So, whether he wasn't as dedicated to the sport, whether he wasn't training as hard, whether his trainer wasn't as effective as it had been early on in his career, or whether he just lost a step, whether the time in jail, the issues he'd had outside of the ring had taken it out of him, whatever. I do believe Mike Tyson wasn't the same fighter by the time it gets to 96. As I say, I'm seeing a bit less stamina, a bit less speed in his performance than you witnessed early on. However, I think something that also needs to be acknowledged, and the more research I've done on this, the more I've learned, is that by the time this fight came around, Evander Holyfield, for me, was also past his peak. And that seems bizarre, seeing as that Evander Holyfield was still fighting some 15 years after this matchup. I think Evander Holyfield's last fight was in 2011. So, crazy, crazy stuff. But Evander Holyfield was actually 34 when this fight was first made in 96. 34, I'm not saying it's at the end of a heavyweight career, but it may be the kind of age where you start to talk about heavyweight getting on a bit. He was the older man in there. He was 3 or 4 years older than Tyson, I believe. And Holyfield had a lot of wear and tear. A lot of wear and tear. For a start, he'd had health problems. There was talk about him suffering with hepatitis after the final loss to Riddick Bowe. He'd moved up in weight division. Holyfield often thought of as a cruiserweight. He was now fighting up at heavyweight. He'd had some real grueling fights, not least the trilogy with Riddick Bowe. When I made this video, I rewatched a lot of old fights before I sat down to make this video. So I don't mind telling you, I rewatched the Riddick Bowe fights with Holyfield. I had a look at some other Tyson fights. I had a look at Tyson versus Trevor Burbick, Tyson versus Tony Tubbs. Obviously, the 2 Tyson versus Holyfield fights. Let me say, Holyfield had a lot of miles on the clock by the time he stepped in the ring with Tyson, right? So, those Riddick Bowe fights, if you haven't seen them, I urge you to check them out. Those are some serious fights. Fight of the year contenders, easy. But those were the kind of fights that can shorten a man's career. Very, very definitely. Those are the kind of fights that can take something away from you. And Holyfield had been through 3 of those fights. He'd had other tough fights as well, in a weight division that wasn't his natural weight division. And even by looking at Evander Holyfield, you don't even have to watch him fight, just by looking at Evander Holyfield, you can see by the time he gets in the ring with Tyson, he's a bit heavier. He's a little bit more stationary than he was earlier on in his career. A bit more muscle bound. All of these things with Evander Holyfield. So whilst I would acknowledge, like a lot of Tyson fans do put forward online, that Tyson was past his peak by the time the Holyfield fight happens, I actually think Holyfield was past his peak. And there's several reasons to believe that Mike Tyson was the fresher of the 2. Not least because Holyfield was the substantially older man, but also because of the fact, well, if you look at Tyson's career, he'd had substantial periods of inactivity, obviously jail, and I'm not saying that's good for a career, but and a lot of Tyson fights. How many Tyson fights were 1-round jobs? Even the tough fights. Even some of the world title fights were 1 fights, 1 round, 2 round, etc. Holyfield was older. He was in an unnatural weight division. He'd been through grueling, tough wars. The public perception when this fight was made was that Holyfield was past it. Was that Holyfield was a substantial underdog. He was a bit of a washed-up fighter, and that Tyson, having come out of jail, having had 1 or 2 comeback fights and looked good in them, could potentially be back to his very best. So the public perception going into this fight was very, very much against Evander Holyfield. At least that's what my research tells me. I can't tell you that I recall the public perception at the time the fight was being made. Unfortunately, I was too young. So my suggestion is that by the time both guys got in the ring, neither of them were at their peak. You look at Holyfield's career, you look at the fights with Holmes, Foreman, Buster Douglas, some of these serious fights. What's the other one I had a look at? Tillis. These fights were in the late 80s as well. when Holyfield was putting in some of his early best form, way before he started dropping losses to guys like Michael Moorer, Riddick Bowe, etc. So my perception is that both of these guys were past the prime when they stepped into the ring. But it is logical and possible to make an argument that Tyson was the fresher man, having had less wars, more quick wins, not being as active, etc. Although I acknowledge the activity can still be a negative if you're ring rust. But he'd had 2 combat fights, etc. Now, talking about those 2 fights, in 1996, in the first fight, the one that was billed as finally, Holyfield wins by 11th round TKO. The majority of people watching this video will have probably seen the fight. I'm not going to talk through it in round by round detail. These videos, they're going to be long enough anyway without me doing that. What I will say, for me, this is a pure occasion of Tyson trying to enforce his style on an opponent and him not liking what the opponent was coming back with. From the first round, you can see Mike Tyson Evander Holyfield standing up to Mike Tyson. Holyfield was unintimidated by Tyson. Tyson throws a big punch after the bell that lands on Evander Holyfield. If I recall, potentially in the very first round, Holyfield answers back, and even though the referee's between them, lands a punch back on Mike Tyson after the bell. He shows he's not prepared to be bullied. He stands up to Mike Tyson. Bizarrely, interestingly, Holyfield appears to be the stronger man in the clinch. He pushes Tyson a lot. He uses his size on Tyson. To my naked eye, he appeared to be a physically bigger man than Mike Tyson. I think that was a surprise to public consensus at the time, seeing as Tyson was the heavyweight, Holyfield was the cruiserweight. But you see Holyfield out-muscling, out-strengthening, out-hustling Mike Tyson. You see Holyfield bringing that fight to Tyson, not being afraid to stand toe-to-toe, not being afraid to go to war with Mike Tyson. And you kind of see Tyson, for me, getting outdone by that. Tyson, from what I've seen, may not be the most versatile fighter. Now, that's not necessarily his fault. He was a very short, very stocky heavyweight who'd mastered a specific style. It's not going to be that Holyfield was bringing the fight so he could reinvent himself as a 6'8", back foot slickster who could pick rounds up with the jab. But what you kind of see in that fight for me is when Holyfield starts to pull ahead, there isn't necessarily the adjustment from Mike Tyson. And essentially, the fight continues in the same pattern, round after round after round, with Holyfield being the better man for me. Holyfield is not only bigger and stronger, he's not only happy to stand up to Tyson and go toe-to-toe with Tyson, but you see some real education behind Holyfield's work. We know Holyfield is a smart boxer. We know he's got that amateur pedigree. You can see that in there. Holyfield is this is not pure blood and guts. There's a lot of blood and guts, but there's a lot of education in there. Holyfield's picking his punches nicely. The 97 fight is probably the more memorable over the 2, the bite fight. In that fight, Mike Tyson, for my money, effectively quits. He can't see a way out. So he bites Evander Holyfield. I think he bites him on both ears in the end. The referee is left with no option but to disqualify Mike Tyson. Really, in those first 3 rounds, you do see a similar pattern, from the first fight. Tyson comes charging out, goes straight at Evander Holyfield, comes forward, looks to bring the pace, looks to force the aggression. Holyfield is there. He's in front of Tyson. He's happy to stand up to Tyson. He's going to go into the trenches with Tyson. He's strong. He's not going to be bullied. He's not going to be intimidated. And, essentially Tyson doesn't have an answer. And for me, in the first fight, Tyson took a lot of shots. In the second fight, he looks for a way out. He knew he was putting the referee in a position where the referee had no option but to rule that fight off. When he persisted with biting Evander Holyfield. And these were not just little nibbles, these were grievous bites. I've looked at a lot of the surrounding media reports, a lot of the interviews after this fight. Mike Tyson blames a lot of it on Holyfield's dirtiness. He says Holyfield consistently leads with the head. And I think there is a strong element of that. There really is. You look back at these Holyfield fights, Holyfield was not the cleanest of fighters. Mike makes a fair point when he highlights that, and that's something boxing fans shouldn't ignore. But for me, some of the other articles I've read are just as convincing. Teddy Atlas, I've read an article where he was quoted as saying that Mike often got disheartened when he couldn't beat an opponent. You know, if he couldn't hurt an opponent, if he couldn't show his power against an opponent, make them scared of him, make them hurt him, he was mentally weakened. Mike Tyson didn't like it when he couldn't hurt an opponent. Holyfield believes Tyson looked for a way out because he simply couldn't deal with what Holyfield was offering. I saw an interview with Lou Duva, who talked about how Holyfield had studied Tyson's style, how he'd gone to bed every single night dreaming about trying to get Tyson beat. You know, how he was kind of obsessed with Tyson going into the rematch. One of the things Firas mentioned when he made the request is, did Holyfield look at the success of guys like Trevor Berbick and Tony Tubbs when they fought Tyson, and how sometimes, you know, they were able to have success up close against Tyson? I don't think he said it in those exact words, but, you know, that's what I took from it, rightly or wrongly. Now, I've rewatched both of those fights. They're both nice, easy fights to watch. They only last 2 rounds. And it is accurate to say that in both of those fights, the opponents land punches, and land notable punches of Mike Tyson. However, for me, both of those guys almost sacrificed themselves in order to land those punches. You know, they land those punches, stand into the fury with Mike Tyson, and he's able to stop them in 2 rounds. So, do I genuinely believe Holyfield looked back at those 2 fights and believes that he's going to beat Tyson by doing what Trevor Berbick did and what Tony Tubbs did? Probably not. You know, maybe he'd spent ages watching Tyson fights. Maybe he was obsessed with getting Tyson beat. Maybe he'd noted some of the punches that those guys were able to land. But fundamentally, you can't take too much heart from those performances, because Tyson, you know, knocks them out in 2 rounds. For me, what Holyfield has done here is not allow a guy who fights like a bully to bully him. And as is often the way with bullies, and I'm not calling Mike a bully outside of the ring necessarily, I'm talking about his fight style, if you like, inside the ring. But what you find with bullies in many, many ways of life is that if you stand up to them, there isn't too much behind it. And, you know, Tyson, who was a very, very, very good fighter, for me, when Holyfield was able to stand there, when Holyfield had the toughness, the strength to take his punches, and when Holyfield had the relentlessness and the engine to keep coming, what you actually find is that Holyfield was able to break Mike Tyson in both fights. That's my take on it. Mike Tyson was a guy who was broken in both fights. Evander Holyfield won both fights because he was unbreakable. He was not prepared to be moved. He was not prepared to be beaten, to give up, to get knocked out. He was standing there, he had the durability, he had his own power, he had his own skill to get the job done. He went straight in to Mike Tyson's engine room, you know, and he got the business done. You know, I did, in the first video I did on Mike Tyson, I talked about that James Tillis fight, where James Tillis used movement, used range, used slickness, tried to frustrate, tried to outclass Tyson with boxing pedigree. You know, I talked about that being a potential way some of the modern day heavyweights could approach this fight. None of the modern day heavyweights could approach their fight with Tyson in the same way that Evander Holyfield did, because I don't believe any of them have the combination of durability, heart, engine, and educated pressure that Evander Holyfield was able to bring, and essentially stand in the eye of a storm and go to war with Mike Tyson. So, we're about 18 minutes in, and I haven't yet answered the question, which tells me I need to sharpen up my presentation a bit. To summarise, by the time these guys step into the ring, they're both past their peak. Tyson has visibly slipped. He hasn't slipped as badly as when he fought Lennox Lewis, but he's visibly slipped. Holyfield is older. He's been through wars. He's had health problems. And despite the fact that both guys have physically slipped, Holyfield has emerged definitively superior on both occasions. The question is that the most convincing form, that this would have been the same result if the two guys had fought earlier on in their career? Or do we believe that Mike Tyson would have found the extra level to his game to get Evander Holyfield out of there had he been a younger man. Before I give you my answer to that, let me start with a disclaimer and saying, look, if at 88 Tyson fought a 1990 Holyfield, it would be one hell of a fight. And it's a fight that I would not be going to the bookmakers to place my life savings on, because that is a hugely, hugely, hugely hard call to make. But my take, and it's based purely on instinct, and it's based purely on the fights that I've watched, is that Tyson, for me, was an on-top fighter. Tyson was one of those guys who looked absolutely devastating when he was allowed to dictate a fight, when he was allowed to fully implement his style on another guy, when he could hurt them. I don't believe Tyson is as quite the unstoppable force as some people make out. If you watch the James Tillis fight, and I've referenced this several times now in the videos I've made on Mike Tyson, you can see that it is possible to have success against Mike Tyson by keeping the fight long, by manoeuvring around a smaller man. If you watch the Evander Holyfield fight, you can see that it is possible to have success by bringing the fight to Tyson, standing up to him, to taking the fight into the eye of the storm, as I said earlier. Tyson looks more devastating than 90% of heavyweights when he's on top because of the way he fights, the style he implements, the power, the athleticism, the speed, the explosiveness. He's going to look far more devastating than most fighters when he's on top. But for me, when he's not on top, when the going gets tough, there's always been vulnerability there. And there was vulnerability there even when he was in his peak years. Even when he was peak years. I think people are so used to watching Mike Tyson highlight reels that sometimes it's easy to forget some of the Mike Tyson rounds that weren't highlight reels. He wasn't this unstoppable force. He could turn into that if you allowed him to, and the vast majority of fighters couldn't find the answer. But I think that when the going got tough for Mike Tyson, he probably was not as formidable as when the going got tough for Evander Holyfield. And Evander Holyfield, for me, had the ability to dig a little bit deeper, go into the trenches a little bit more. Just rewatch that Riddick Bowe 1 fight, or if you want to see some evidence of that. My take is that a lot of fighters have specific opponents that can be their kryptonite. And I believe there is a strong possibility Evander Holyfield was that kryptonite for Mike Tyson. He certainly was in 96. He certainly was in 97. On the balance of probability, he may well have been in 1990 had they fought. Because Evander Holyfield just was not going to be pushed around. He wasn't going to be bullied. He wasn't going to allow Tyson to hit him after the bell. He wasn't going to allow Tyson to force him on the back foot. He wasn't going to allow Tyson to hit and not get hit. And with him bringing that heart, that durability, that mindset, that chin, combined with the class, the education, the boxing pedigree, for me it did serve as that kryptonite for Mike Tyson. Don't get me wrong, Mike Tyson in his early 20s was faster, was more explosive, probably hit harder than the Mike Tyson we saw in 96. So I'm not trying to give you this answer and say that it's a fact, but it's just my opinion based on what I've researched and what I've seen. I don't think Tyson would have had the beating of Evander Holyfield, and I just think it was one of those matchups that probably wouldn't have ever worked out too well for Mike Tyson. I appreciate you have your Tyson fanatics. You probably have more Tyson fanatics than any other, historical heavyweight fanatic. And you do, when you make videos like this, you do get a lot of comments saying Tyson would have walked through Evander Holyfield in 1 or 2 rounds, had he had Holyfield fought him in the 80s, but you know, he didn't walk through Mitch Green in 1 or 2 rounds. He didn't walk through James Tillis in 1 or 2 rounds. You know, and Holyfield was a very, very, very tough man. I believe he got stopped late on in his career, but the only time he got stopped as a young man was in the third Riddick Bowe fight, when I believe he had severe medical issues outside of the ring with hepatitis, which kind of sort of tied in with how his stamina just went from 60 to 0 instantly in that fight, I'm thinking. But, you know, that's my take on it. Tyson, devastating when he's allowed to be on top. Not a versatile fighter. Not a fighter with an immense plan B, but a fighter who had truly mastered one style, and that was the peekaboo, high presser, bullying style. When someone was able to stand up to him, when someone was able to live with it, then Tyson would possibly crack easier than Evander Holyfield. If the two guys fought peak for peak, I'm taking Evander Holyfield to confirm the form of their 96 and 97 fights. Admittedly, in a fight of the year, greatest fight of all time contender. That's my take. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know your thoughts on any of the comments I've made in this video. Who would you be picking in that mythical matchup? I'm interested to hear some feedback on this video. It's not the kind of typical video I do on the channel. You guys know it's something a little bit different. Let me know your thoughts. Did you enjoy it? Is it the type of content you like to see? Drop me a comment. The other disclaimer, which I have said a few times in this video, is I'm informing my opinions from a huge amount of research, looking at old fights, looking at interviews. It's not something that I have lived through and can remember, you know. So somebody who was there at the time, somebody who remembers the fights watching live, may have more clear opinions on certain elements of this take, but all I can do is what I can do. Thanks for watching. As I mentioned at the start of the video, please subscribe, please hit the thumbs up button. As always, appreciate you guys taking the time to watch my